For those of you online who are good lip readers, I apologize, but I'm going to have to repeat myself. We had a great morning panel. We've reconvened. We've got a fantastic one in front of us. This one's going to address political corruption. It's going to be chaired by one of George Washington University Law School's very own, Professor Jessica Tillipman. We're also joined by a guest from Guatemala, Claudia Escobar, who's really persevered today, woke up with a stuffy nose and a headache, as I understand, but thanks for joining us, Claudia. A trusted colleague of ours for many years, Todd Robinson, who's the Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, or INL, as we know. And then Kedrick Payne, the Vice President, General Counsel, and Senior Director for Ethics at the Campaign Legal Center. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who is joining us for round two of today's program. And also a big, huge thank you to the ABA for organizing this, especially Mark for helping to organize Substance and your colleagues that have really helped administratively to get this program off the ground. Thanks to everyone also who has come in and braved our security restrictions, which are unusual at our law school. So we appreciate your patience, and for those of you that have made it here. And also a big hello and thank you for joining us for those of you that are joining us online. So when we were discussing today's theme for the event, we were trying to think of two big topics that we could address that are a little bit different, that we're not seeing in a lot of programming, but incredibly important. And national security obviously was really fascinating to listen to, because we don't see too many programs on that intersection between national security and corruption. But given that this is the year of elections, and that basically more people are going to the polls this year across the globe than ever, it seemed appropriate to dedicate one of the panels today to a discussion on kind of elections, the political process, among other issues, in light of the again the big sweeping electoral process happening in countries around the world. And then we started to think further. And when I sat down with the panelists for this program who have been introduced, and we thought, well, how are we going to address this? And really it comes down to two things. Even though this is the year of elections, we definitely want to focus a little bit on that, but also the issue of money and politics. We talk a little bit about kind of the influence of money and the impact it has, particularly in the anti-corruption efforts and in the way it potentially perpetuates corruption in global systems, and the role of dark money, among other sorts of things. And so I wanted to focus on that issue too, because we see a lot of these global instruments that talk about the issue of influence peddling and the issue of money and politics, but we haven't seen, I think, as much progress in that area globally as we have seen sometimes on the anti-bribery front or some of the other areas. So I think it's really important that we not only talk today about elections and making sure the electoral process is free from corruption, but also focusing on the role of corruption and money in the political process. So with that Herculean task ahead of us, I will turn directly to Todd, with starting it off with you first. Let's talk about the electoral process. How are you, what is the work, kind of the work you're doing, but how are these issues of corruption addressing kind of global electoral issues? And maybe you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's really great to be here with such an experienced group. So, you know, when we think about, when we think at the State Department, when we think about corruption, we are looking at all of the elites, all of the groups that want to be involved in a political process globally. So you're talking transnational organized criminals. We're talking political elites, economic elites. And what are they looking for? They're looking for power and impunity. Those are the driving forces. That's why they are suborning legislators. That's why they're suborning justice systems. And so that's what we focus on at the State Department, making sure that we give countries that are trending democratically or involved in reform efforts, the tools, both technical and political, to fight these networks, to fight these elites that want control of their system. Claudia and I go way back. I was ambassador in Guatemala from 14 to 17. I was DCM, the #2 in Guatemala from 2009 to 11. And, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador are case studies in elites that want control of the system, both the economic system and the political system. And Guatemala, at least for a few years, was a case study in how the international community can help a country make inroads and break down some of those forces that are striving for control of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on one of the biggest issues is kind of the entrenchment of some of these issues and the kind of impunity when these things go on for so long, and it almost seems impossible to get your hands around the issue. Since you so eloquently introduced Claudia to the discussion, we're going to just turn to you next, Claudia. You've had extensive experience as a magistrate in Guatemala, and then you've also been a significant advocate for judicial independence. So we've talked a little bit about the elites and trying to maintain that control, but the judiciary plays a large role, particularly when it comes to corruption impacting elections. Could you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, well, I really consider that there is different types of corruption. And when we're talking about judicial corruption, we're really thinking about the worst type, because it really can undermine any effort to strengthen other institutions. And if we compare this to cancer, it will be as a metastatic cancer. So from my point of view, we have to protect judicial institutions. When I was a judge for almost 10 years, and I had to face different threats during my tenure, first from clerks or from lawyers that wanted to influence me or to pressure me to issue resolutions that will favor their cases. But the worst case was when I had to confront the head of the Congress that wanted to pressure me to favor the vice president who was in power, who wanted to run for a second term, and they were the Supreme Court, but in this case, it's the Supreme Court that deals with elections, was barring her from running for a second term. And that's when they came to my court and they tried to pressure me. I had to denounce. He went to trial and he was found guilty of influence peddling and bribery. So that's one example of how can they really undermine the institutions. They never imagined that there was going to be a judge in the context of Guatemala that will tell them no, because the independence of the judiciary is not guaranteed in countries like Guatemala, like El Salvador, Honduras, many countries in Latin America. The judiciary sometimes depends on political appointments, and that makes things dangerous, for the institutions.
If I could just do one quick follow-up before I move to Kedrick, I'm not forgetting you, I promise. You talked a little bit about the fact that they encountered a judge that never had one that said no, right? And one of the challenges that we see, particularly in countries, including our own, that struggle with such significant corruption issues, is the fact that people don't say no. There's a lot of pressure to say yes. I don't want to say, I hate the idea of the phrase, it's a way of life or it's part of our culture. I don't love to think of, the everyday person thinking like, I just want to wake up today and pay a bribe. It's more about this kind of impunity and the lack of consequences. And part of that is the lack of support you probably feel from saying no. And we have tools out there. In the United States, we believe strongly in kind of whistleblower protections and incentivizing whistleblowing, incentivizing disclosures. But globally, a lot of countries still have a lot of work to do in that area. Do you think that was one of the issues of not having kind of resources available to you and having that ability, and other kind of folks that are in charge or in power that don't have ways to basically deal with some of these issues or have support in that way?
Well, that could be one of the reasons, but sometimes we have laws and we have protections and we have the mechanisms to do it, but the problem is, how do you implement them? So one thing is to have them in paper, and another thing is, how do you really implement that law? And that requires ethics, and that requires people to feel safe. And that's another issue that I think that we must think about. How safe do you feel? Guatemala is a post-conflict country. It went through a long period of civil war for almost 40 years. So building the rule of law in a country like that requires a lot of effort. It's one of the most violent region, the whole northern triangle of Central America. So you have to imagine how difficult can be for a judge to feel secure in an environment like that. So it's not only about the legal protection, but about also the physical protection and the risk that you face doing your job there.
All right, Kedrick, I want to turn to you on this. So I actually have two questions for you on this particular topic related to elections. So along the same line of the judiciary, before I get to my other question, in the United States, the Supreme Court is actually playing a significant role in our own electoral conflicts, if you will, or electoral litigation. But the Supreme Court has had its own ethics challenges in the United States, because the subject today is at home and abroad. So turning to at home, maybe you can speak a little bit about what that does to maybe undermine efforts to address potential corruption issues in elections in the United States.
Yes, I think the situation we're in right now, where the Supreme Court is hearing cases that involve President Trump, as he is the front runner for the GOP, at the same time that the Supreme Court is under this ethical cloud, that some of the justices on the court are not complying with ethics rules, and therefore there may be questions about the decisions they make, just chips away at the trust in elections. And that appearance of corruption, unlike in some countries where you truly know that there's corruption with the judiciary, there's this appearance that things may be corrupt, has the same impact, has the same effect. So you go from what we had in 2020, where we had polling that showed that the majority, 74% of conservative-leaning voters thought that they didn't trust the election because there was voter fraud, and people could look at that group of people and say, oh, don't you know there's no evidence or any fraud and you should trust our elections. And you move now where you have liberal-leaning voters could look at the court and what will happen in this case that's pending with presidential immunity, with the justices deciding whether or not essentially Trump's trial will happen before the election. They may start to think, oh, is the system rigged based on the decision that comes out? And you have those two groups both not trusting what's happening in the election, chips away at our democracy, and almost, you hope, guarantees this conversation and these debates that happens after the election, no matter what happens. So that appearance of corruption with the court is directly connected with potential election outcome and how the public accepts those results.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of ethics, because a lot of times people kind of look at them as, we call it the annual flea dip, when you have to go in for your ethics training for government service, or even sometimes with companies when you have ethics training. But it's almost looked down upon as kind of a lesser than, but you hit on that appropriate distinction, that it's about appearance. And sometimes just even the appearance of impropriety can be such as similarly detrimental as actual corruption, and have people losing faith in a process. So I'm glad you focused on that. I want to turn a little bit to a side issue, which is that this kind of loss of faith or loss of trust in government because of these corruption issues actually negatively impacts voter turnout. And I know you've done some work on this area. Could you kind of speak to what that's about?
Yes. So when you have a situation, and this is more so looking at the different states where there were allegations of voter fraud, or there are allegations that the process was not done correctly when people went to the polls, and how their votes were counted, and whether or not there were illegal immigrants voting, or people voting twice. When you have those type of allegations that come up in different states, people who don't have all of the information can think that, oh, will my vote count? It doesn't really matter if I vote. Can I trust that process? And what's necessary is for them to get the information that, yes, you can trust the process. Yes, you can see that there was no evidence of this voter fraud, but you're fighting against a large volume of noise out there that tries to convince people that they shouldn't trust the process, and that can affect voter turnout. And we won't know until this election happens whether or not there is that type of impact on the election, where the voter turnout really will decide this election.
Todd, do you think that that's a global issue, this kind of trust in the process? And maybe you can speak a little bit about that, not just in the United States, because we hear so much about it here.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think we have entered a period where almost any decision by any judge anywhere is sort of seen not in the context of the case, but in the context of some politics. And I think in many ways, these elites, these networks that have been chipping away at the credibility of justice systems, this is what they want. They're able to better control a judiciary or an attorney general if they can turn the issue into, what side are you on versus the facts of the case. No one, in many instances, the facts of the case almost don't even matter. The general public doesn't talk about it. They talk about where they think the judge or the prosecutor is coming from some other platform. And we see it here in the United States, but we see it in other countries as well, where because a ruling is made, and immediately people take sides. This was against me because I'm from X party, versus this is what the facts. This is where the facts led the judge. And I think it's I don't know. I mean, it seems like a recent phenomenon. I don't remember this. I've spent most of my time abroad. I don't remember this being such a thing in the past. But it's clear today that that system, justice systems, legislative systems are seen almost, in a different. There's a different category. They're not seen as just legislators that are doing the work that needs to be done to be educated on an issue and then voting in that way. They're seen as it's us or them. It's an interesting and disturbing phenomenon, I think.
I think it also goes along with that similar trend of why do we increasingly see corrupt political officials not resign anymore? There used to be like almost an automatic if there's like a whiff of scandal, and now it's like, I did it. So what? I just feel like the dynamics have shifted remarkably in recent years. So let me go back to Claudia before we move on to kind of money and politics. And what would you think are some of the more effective strategies to combat this issue? Because we've talked about the influence of corruption in the electoral process, particularly as it impacts the judiciary. So, if you could come up with the solution, and go. Good luck.
I wish I could have the right answer, but I think that one key issue is how do you really help the judiciary to appoint or elect the best people for the judiciary. If you are sick and you want to go to the doctor, you try to look for the best doctors. So when you think about the courts, especially the higher courts, you have to look for the best lawyers. And maybe not only the ones that have the more knowledge or experience, but also the ones that are, that are honest. And that is very difficult to, sometimes it's difficult to prove or difficult to have the resources, how to guarantee that someone that is going to sit in the bench is really someone that is going to be ethic. And that's why I think that we need to put attention also to the election of judges, not only to general election. There is a lot of effort to look about the election of presidents and Congress, but never, internationally, there's not a lot of attention to look about what is happening in the judiciaries. And I think that needs to change. Right now, the country of Guatemala asked the OAS to create a mission to look about what is going to happen in the election of judges this year. And I think that's key. I will reinforce that combating corruption actively requires an independent judiciary. And I think we're going to see in the next month, what is the role that the international organizations can play in looking at making sure that the principles to elect judges, independent judges, and a merit process instead of a political appointment is done there.
Can I just add, I think Claudia has hit on something that's really, really important. The role of the international community in some instances can really be a game changer. We saw it in Honduras when the OAS was involved. We saw it in Guatemala when the UN was involved. And we're seeing it in places like Georgia, where the European Union is involved in fighting back against laws that are, frankly, anti-democratic. When you have a reform-minded group and the international community that is willing to meet people where they are and explain why this is important to, a village outside of the capital, then you can really make a difference. But you can't be flying at 30,000 feet on these issues. You have to, get your hands dirty. You have to explain to people plainly what is at stake if they allow corrupt judges on the court, or and a corrupt attorney general to wield justice for their own purposes and not for the purposes of the country. I think the role of the international community is really important in this.
And that gets back to the idea that you already said, where you have someone who is doing that, but potentially could be blaming it on politics or a political attack. I mean, the whole thing is,
well, and
disappointing.
when it's being successful, because the first thing governments that have been subject to these rules do when they come into power is get rid of the international structures that have been set up to continue the reform efforts. And that's what happened in Honduras, and that's what happened in Guatemala.
Absolutely. All right, let's turn topics a little bit. And I know that some of the panelists have heard this story, but one of the things that really strikes me about the issue of kind of corruption of the political process or money in politics is how much I almost feel like in the United States, sometimes we view it as like a campaign finance issue, and it's like a separate domain a little bit from some of the anti-corruption work I see a lot. But my own anecdote was that as like a lot of you that are here today, and those of you that are probably joining us online, a lot of us do a lot of capacity building work with different countries. And I was doing a work for on behalf of a United States government program with the group from a country, and I had just done my hour-long presentation on anti-corruption efforts and tools and mechanisms and government procurement. And throughout the entire process, one of the officials just kept looking at me skeptically. And he had this look, and we always try very hard not to have a voice of, the United States says to do X or the United States says to do Y, because that's off-putting to any audience. But this one was particularly skeptical as I was speaking the entire hour. And I had just finished up saying, we have fairly strong and robust anti-corruption tools in the United States. And he leans back in his chair and he crosses his arms and he says to me, "Talk to me about Citizens United." And I remember all the air was sucked out of the room. And I'll never forget that that horror story, for me at least. And so when I think of Citizens United, and I have mental flashbacks to that moment and having no response, other than we have our issues too. I'm going to turn to Kedrick and start with you, because we have problems with money in politics and the laws that are designed to address this. And that doesn't necessarily trigger what we would think of as traditional corruption. We're not talking about bribes, yet its impact is just as problematic. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit about the inadequacy in the United States.
Yes, well, the person who was staring at you was right to mention Citizens United because it did change so much. But we've been talking about that for over a decade, the role of super PACs, these PACs that can accept unlimited contributions, even from corporations or wealthy individuals, put that into elections in what's called independent expenditures, meaning they're supposed to be spending that money without the input of the candidate, but we know that happens. Well, we know that is the risk. We understand that that's the risk. But now it's morphing into a bigger problem than was expected, and the corruption impact goes beyond simply the campaign finance laws. It's the lobbying laws, the gift laws, and the ethics laws. So, for example, it was just revealed, I think about a month ago, that a well-known senator has a podcast, a very popular podcast, and the podcast is sponsored, produced, and distributed by a media company. This media company also is a lobbyist, and that lobbyist has legislation that is before the committee where that senator is a leading member. And under the lobbying laws, it's an absolute ban for that company to give anything free to that senator. So gift law for lobbyists says can get a free podcast distribution production deal, can't do that. It also is illegal, a ban under the ethics laws for that senator to get paid for that very lucrative podcast is making so much money with advertising. It also is, there's a ban on the corporation giving money directly to that senator's campaign. So what do they do to get the money to that senator? They give it to a super PAC. They give it to his super PAC. $600,000 went there. And the question is now, nobody saw this coming. It's called, instead of calling it a contribution, it was put into the Federal Election Commission reports as ad revenue. Didn't see that coming. So you have to, our organization files complaints and try to get ahead of this new corruption that's happening with Citizens United having super PACs that are morphed into essentially having a senator who has legislation before him from his employer that's giving that money to help his campaign. And it's not clear what if the law prohibits that. Well, I think it is, but we don't have that ruling yet. So it's just morphed into something that was not expected.
So we know that campaign finance laws have so many significant loopholes. You could drive a truck through most of them. But one other issue that I think interests both of us is this issue of congressional stock ownership too. It's, there was a significant attempt, I think it was a few years ago now, a few years ago, to actually prohibit members from owning stock. And it's similar to the restrictions that we actually have in the executive branch in the United States. And I'm sure you have your own and you can share a story. I know once I was called by a reporter because he was mentioning that a member of the House Armed Services Committee owns stock in a major defense contractor. And if anybody knows what the House Armed Services Committee does, is it legislates or regarding defense legislation that impacts defense contractors. And if this were to be an executive branch fact pattern, that would be illegal and problematic, and you could be criminally prosecuted for some of the stuff that we see. Yet in Congress, we see these kind of things happening all the time. Is there anything to be done about this? Is there any support for changing it beyond kind of that initial push we saw a few years back?
There's no easy answer to seeing whether or not we're going to get support for this. 'Cause the problem is so big that I remember when I was an investigator at the Office of Congressional Ethics around 2012, there was a member of Congress who was the chairman of a financial services committee who went to a closed-door meeting with the president, the head of the SEC, the Fed chair, and the House leadership, left that meeting, started selling stock. This was right before the collapse of that brought on the Great Recession. Couldn't prove insider trading because how do you know what information was not public at that time, because everyone knew there was sort of a problem with the economy. So you can't, it's hard to prove insider trading if you go after the people who just have stock and they're on the committee and they bought the stock that happens to be a contractor is regulated by that committee. So you have to just ban them holding stock. It's hard to get any consensus right now because the public attention has to keep pushing it. So if the only corruption going on right now involves stock trading, then you probably could get this groundswell of a push for new laws, which happened a few years ago. So we got bipartisan legislation drafted, but couldn't get it across the finish line. So unfortunately, the hope ends up being that you see more of the problem, which we are seeing. So at this point, you see that from 2020, where the concern was insider trading right before the pandemic, it's now to the point that people assume that all members of Congress are trading with inside information. So you have EFTs that are making money with people investing, hoping that they follow the trades. So the EFT follows the trades of members of Congress, and it's beating the market. So people are investing, hoping that there's inside information that these members have, so they also can profit. And that's a worse situation.
Incredibly depressing. And then the other somewhat nefarious result is that you had some versions of the legislation being pushed that basically said, but we won't include spouses or minor children, which is just like 101 anti-corruption. You got to go directly and indirectly when you're trying to combat corruption. So you would hate then that Congress celebrates a push for something substantial that has such huge loopholes that it's actually meaningless. So turning outside of the United States, Todd, is this also an issue, this issue of money in politics? Because it feels really bad in the United States. Is it, do we see this in other countries as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We see it in other countries, and except for the more like-minded European, Western-leaning countries, the guardrails are just not there, and that's why the U.S. government has spent so much time working in sort of with international fora. This past year, the United States hosted the Conference of State Parties for the UN Anti-Corruption Convention. First time we've ever hosted, and these types of events demonstrate USG leadership in setting the international rule book for transparency and good governance. This administration has, from the very beginning, through a national security memorandum in 2021, the naming of a global anti-corruption coordinator in 2022, they've made it very clear, this administration has made it very clear that the fight against corruption is something that they see as a threat to the United States national security. Let's be clear, we're in a battle for how these rules are set. certainly in the UN, but in other international fora. You know, the PRC, once the rules set, wants to try to have the international community model their rules. Russia certainly wants the international community to rally around, you know, their vision of transparency and good governance. Iran would love to see the international community put rules that would favor their vision of this issue. So we are, you know, U.S. diplomats are fighting tooth and nail around the world, bringing the G7 along, bringing the G20 along, working with the Organization of American States, trying to convince other countries that that a vision of that involves ethics, that involves transparency, that involves open markets, is beneficial. And I think this is really clear. If we don't show that this is beneficial, if we don't show this is going to work, then those other countries are going to gain a leg up. And you can see where these other countries are putting their attention in terms of leadership in international fora. I was in Italy last year for a G7 meeting, and there was an event going on, and it never occurred to me that there was an official from the PRC as the head of the World Food and Agriculture Organization, which had traditionally been, often been someone from the United States. So they understand the playing field, and they are now fielding players throughout the UN organization, throughout other international fora. And we're going to see more and more of this because they understand that for years, the West has been setting the rules on, international finance, banking, mergers and acquisitions. And none of those, if you are a political system or an economic system that prizes confidentiality over transparency, then you're going to want to get your person as the head of these organizations so that you can start changing the rules.
I feel like this is the scariest panel of the day. And the other one was national security. So Claudia, to follow up on that, I mean, how effective are these kind of international institutions, especially now that we hear that they're so vulnerable to being taken over by, let's say, entities or even countries that have less of an interest in fostering the kind of transparency and anti-corruption movement?
Well, I think it really depends on the case. I think that, right now we have global threats. We need to understand that the international organized crime has an effect in elections. They're putting money and they're controlling institutions when they're weak in countries that don't have the power to look at that. And I think this is an asymmetrical fight, and it really needs international organizations to be built to address that problem. In Guatemala, we had an example with the International Commission Against Impunity, but it was dismantled, when the government found out that they were investigating them in high cases of corruption. So I think that when we talk about corruption, we have to understand that it's not only one sector, that is sectors that are interlinked. In our country, there is an organization that is called the Corrupt Pact, El Pacto de Corruptos. This is a criminal alliance where we can identify people from the private sector that doesn't want to pay taxes and they want to benefit from controlling the institutions. But there's also people from the army that fought in the Civil War. There's people from organized crime, and it's very easy to identify. And of course, there are corrupt politicians. So to address those threats, we need international organizations to look at that. And I think that the European Union has been very successful in building mechanisms to address how to strengthen the rule of law. And maybe we should try to create more international organizations like that.
Along that same vein, and I'm actually gonna keep forgetting to turn my mic back on. I want to go along that thread of like what you would recommend to do, and also note that for those of you that are online and for those of you that are in the room, in a few minutes, I'm going to turn to opening it up for questions. So get those questions ready. But following along that same train of thought that Claudia just ended with this idea of kind of like, what would you do if you could change things? I asked the other question of the panelists too. And so Kedrick, I'm coming to you. If you could pick one thing, I know you have a laundry list a mile long, but if you could pick one thing that if you could tackle it today, what would be that thing when it comes to like maybe disclosures or enforcement, or what would that be for you?
The main thing would be to have more enforcement. There are two categories of things that are corrupt, whether you're looking at the judicial branch, legislative branch, or even the executive branch. You have the things that there are rules for, and then you have the things where there are no rules for you, so you need to create rules for them. But we can first start with just enforcing the rules that exist. And there doesn't seem to be the culture of enforcement that existed not that long ago. In the 80s and 90s, there were the ethics committees in the Congress, in the House and the Senate were very active. So you constantly had the public knowing that the ethics issues were taken seriously. You look now where Senator Menendez is under in trial with the Department of Justice, but Senate Ethics Committee hasn't said anything about this. They don't address this from an ethics perspective. Same thing happens on the House side. We have members indicted by the Justice Department, but there's other conduct that's going on by House members that the Ethics Committee ignores. With the judiciary, with the like Supreme Court, for example, to get honor out of that cloud of ethical issues, the Supreme Court finally adopted an ethics code, a code of conduct last year, because they never had a code of conduct, which is just a totally different topic. But then there's no enforcement. So there's nothing in there to enforce that code of conduct. Clearly, you're not going to have the another branch come in and enforce it against the court. That's not what you want. But do you have something internal like any other entity would have, where someone is in charge for making sure that people aren't complying with this? Those little things when it comes to enforcement are necessary, and that's what I would push for.
Yeah, and I would just add on the international side, targeted sanctions and visa restrictions. We know both of those things work when employed against international actors around the world. This administration has been very clear that they are more than willing to use those sanctions and visa restrictions to force change if change is not forthcoming.
What, do you feel like other countries use that effectively as well? Or what do you think stops these tools from being used at their fullest potential?
No, I would say other countries, the European Union is it's a different animal, right? Because they have to get consensus from all 27 countries in order to, I think it's 27, there might be more now because they have Sweden and Finland. Anyway, but they have to get consensus from all of those countries in order to, as an alliance, a pact, to employ sanctions. So that's a little harder. It takes them a little longer, but when it happens, It's basically the European Union saying, you're no longer welcome into our region. You no longer have access to our financial system. And that is huge. That forces networks, that forces individuals to find other ways to move their money in order to take advantage of their ill-gotten gains.
Do we have any questions from online or in the, okay, there we go. And then we'll fall way back. Should beat you to it.
I have two related questions. The first question is, well, you mentioned backlash often comes with things. So when the international community is supporting anti-corruption efforts, what more can we do to ensure that, say, in Guatemala, when the mandate is renewed, that the backlash is not just backfighting, but it's also in retaliation against those actors who work on anti-corruption efforts. Secondly, I think what we've seen is often there's a trend of using corruption charges against anti-corruption acts. So we monitored the case of Jose Mora, a Guatemalan journalist who had reported on corruption for a long time. And, some of the charges he faced from money laundering and influence kind of blackmail. So I think it can be very confusing for the public where, they've been hearing about corruption charges, prosecution for corruption for so long, and now, they're now being levied against those actors who were calling out corruption. So, how can we cut through that misinformation that is being sowed by those, in power who are corrupt, who want to keep their corrupt power? But yeah, those are my.
Well, I think they're two very good questions. I'll say in the first one, frankly, we have not done a good enough job in protecting those anti-corruption champions around the world. We reward them, we laud them, we have, I think in the past, used the fact that we are showing public support for them as sort of a shield, sensing that has been a shield for these actors, and increasingly it is not a shield. And so we have to get to the other point, I think we have to do a better job of coming up with strategies and solutions for the anti-corruption actors. Backlashes are tough, right? Because as we all know, elections have consequences. And so if there's a change in politics in the reform-minded country, or there's a change in politics either in the United States or in other countries that support these reform efforts, then these things can shift. What you can do is try to the best of your ability while you have the opportunity to immunize whatever programs and projects you're implementing from the ups and downs of political change. But that's, it's really hard. You can't stop it. In the election in Mexico, the last election in Mexico, and the first Bukele election in El Salvador, both of them ran on anti-corruption platforms. Both of them said that they were going to bring in the international community to help fight corruption. 4 years on, neither one did either of those things. It's hard.
I just would like to add that, when you fight corruption, corruption fights back. So there's also a backslash when there is an effort to fight these organizations, and you have to be ready. And that's when I really think that the role of the international organization and also of civil society is important, because what is happening in the country can also be addressed, by organizations that are there and that can back up the human rights defenders that are at the front lines. So I think those are two things that we can improve.
Yeah, I would just say real quickly, at the end of the day, change isn't going to happen if the citizenry in country X isn't willing or able to promote it and support it. And that's, civil society. Sometimes it's just, independent media. Um, uh, the international community can help, but if it's not sort of born from within the country, it's not going to happen.
Yes. So kind of building off of the question that was just asked, in a country transitioning from a corrupt state to a non-corrupt one, like we were talking with President Adebayo's commitment with corruption, like Guatemala, how do you navigate? So we did talk about this a little bit, but I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on how to navigate facing the backlash in Congress specifically when trying to pass anti-corruption legislation, when we know that the backlash is coming from corrupt actors. And like you said, we've seen this in Mexico, right? It's like their president had committed to anti-corruption and is now, I would argue, one of the presidents most tied to the narcotic state. So how would we do that? I wanted, Ms. Claudia, you would have some examples.
Well, I really think, that politicians act in base of pressure from the citizens. And I think the role of the citizens here is very important. They have to understand what is at stake, why do we need these reforms? Why do we need this change in the legislation? But, in Guatemala, there's been an offer to reform the constitution to improve the judiciary. And that's been there for 25 years. And every time it gets to the Congress, it doesn't happen because I think there is not enough pressure from the citizens to promote that change. And I think that when there's windows of opportunity like the one that Guatemala has now with the president that has a compromise to fight corruption, I think that the role of the citizens is going to be very important.
About how you would advise our government in its efforts to persuade the American public of the importance of the efforts. And progress that takes place in Ukraine. That's a place where our government is trying to be encouraged. We also have people on Capitol Hill who continue to say that the situation remains hopelessly corrupt because no account is being made. How do you win that argument? How do you explain to the American public what's really happening? Disinformation.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
You
What
have
can
to
you?
educate us.
How do we convince the United States? You said. Well, I think it's important to understand the reality of states that don't have the same tools, the same resources. I think that there are countries where the rule of law is a tradition, and people respect the law, and you see it in simple things. And when you're dealing with countries that are post-conflict countries that went through long periods of civil wars and are not used to respect the law, you need to explain the benefits of that. And sometimes that can also be addressed through commercial treaties, promoting, if you want to have commerce with a big nation like the United States, you have to comply also with some rule of law situations. And that's what happened in the European Union after the World War II. That's how it started, with commercial treaties that then promoted the creation of this space that respect the rule of law in general. Of course, can be improved, but there's some issues that can be promoted that way, I think.
I think you have a very good question. What I would say is, I would be very careful about people who say things are hopeless. because they're, number one, they're not hopeless. There are some talented people around the world that are working on these issues every day. And, if we look at why Russia invaded Ukraine, it's because they were walking that reform path. So I would be very careful about saying things are hopeless. Is it going to happen overnight? No. Is it going to be easy? Not a chance. But I don't think we have, if we want to build a world that that embodies the values of the United States or the West, then we have to keep at it every day. We have to go to these international fora and make our case every day. And we have to support those countries that are willing to take a chance, that reform and strong democratic institutions and open economies are the right way to go. We have to take a chance on them.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned the viral role of and I would like to know how to further strengthen this role, especially when it comes to providing policy recommendations and feedbacks to countries. I would like to bring up an example. So the control done by the IMF and the OECD over countries' legal frameworks and enforcement actions against foreign corruption are done on a voluntary basis, meaning that the countries have to volunteer to corruption. And the thing is that today only 13 or 15 countries have nation that's money, but only one. And so of course this limits the ability of international organizations to provide guidance for. And so my question is, what do you think can be done to incentivize cooperation on a global scale and to consequently increase the.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. What I would say is you're always walking that balance, right? Between telling a country what to do and incentivizing them to do the right thing. Perfect example was the Anti-Corruption Commission in Guatemala, which was done by treaty. Which gave the United Nations maybe a little more strength to require certain actions. I think in the, when you're looking at the IMF, when you were looking at the World Bank, when you're looking at OECD, depending on the country, you may be able to work in a treaty between the international organization and the country. But heads of state, heads of government are loath to give up that kind of control because they know what's at stake. They know what's at risk. The politics in their country may shift, and if they're tied to a treaty, that doesn't give them the flexibility or creativity to move around. Maybe they don't want that. We've seen cases where heads of state will, they believe in the reform effort and they don't want to be able to wiggle out of it, and they don't want what comes after them to be able to wiggle out of it. But those instances are few and far between. Take some deft negotiating. And I don't think there's a one size fit all.
Well, we are at the hour. I'm sorry. I know there were a few more questions in the room, but I pride myself on ending on time. So with that, thank you for those of us that joined us today, both in person and online. And thank you to this wonderful panel for scaring all of us and giving us lots of hopeful statements to end on, sort of. Okay. Thank you again for everything.